The morning sun peeked through the airport windows as Captain Thomas Reed adjusted his uniform in the staff restroom. His eyes, rimmed with dark circles, stared back at him from the mirror. He hadn't slept well. Again. The divorce papers sitting unsigned on his kitchen table had kept him awake, along with worries about his mounting bills. 23 years as a pilot, and he still found himself struggling to keep his life on solid ground. Another day in the friendly skies, he muttered to himself, straightening his cap before heading toward the briefing room. Trans-Global Airlines Flight 257 to Chicago was already facing problems. First, there had been a maintenance delay. Then weather concerns popped up on the radar. Now, as Thomas reviewed the passenger manifest with his co-pilot, Li Chen, they realized they were 30 minutes behind schedule. Weather system moving in from the west, Li said, pointing to the radar display. We might hit some turbulence over the Rockies. Thomas rubbed his temples. Perfect. Just what we need today. The gate agent's voice crackled over the radio. Captain Reed, we're ready to begin boarding. Let's get this show on the road, Thomas said, forcing a smile as he and Lee made their way to the aircraft. Thomas stood at the entrance of the plane, greeting passengers as they boarded. He normally enjoyed this part of the job. The brief connections, the excited children, the nervous first-time flyers he could reassure with a confident smile. Today, though, his smile felt strained, his patience paper-thin. Good morning. Welcome aboard, he repeated mechanically as passengers filed past him. The boarding process was moving smoothly until a commotion near the front of the cabin caught Thomas's attention. A woman in her 30s was struggling with her carry-on bag, trying to lift it into the overhead compartment. She wore simple jeans and a faded blue sweater, her brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Nothing about her particularly remarkable. Several passengers behind her were starting to look annoyed at the delay. Thomas watched as she tried again to hoist the bag, which was clearly too heavy for her. Something inside Thomas snapped. Maybe it was the lack of sleep, the stress of the delays, or the personal problems weighing on his mind. Whatever the reason, he stepped forward with a loud sigh that turned several heads. Ma'am, there's a reason we have baggage weight restrictions, he said, his voice carrying through the cabin. Some of us have places to be today. The woman turned, surprise flashing across her face. A few passengers chuckled nervously. I'm sorry, she said softly. I thought I could manage it. Thomas reached over and easily lifted her bag into the compartment. Next time, check the heavier bags. The rest of us shouldn't have to wait because you wanted to save on baggage fees. A flight attendant named Priya shot Thomas a warning look. In all the years they'd worked together, she'd never seen him speak to a passenger that way. The woman's cheeks flushed pink, but she simply nodded and took her seat. 14C, an aisle seat about halfway down the cabin. She pulled out a book and seemed to disappear into it, avoiding the curious glances from nearby passengers. Thomas returned to the cockpit, a twinge of guilt already forming in his stomach. He knew he'd been out of line, but pride kept him from going back to apologize. Everything okay out there? Lee asked as Thomas settled into his seat. Fine, just an amateur traveler holding up the line. Lee raised an eyebrow but said nothing as they continued their pre-flight checks. The boarding finished 10 minutes later, and soon they were cleared for pushback. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Thomas made the standard announcements, his captain's voice smooth and professional, betraying none of the irritation he'd displayed earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reed speaking. Welcome aboard Trans-Global Airlines Flight 257 to Chicago. We're currently number 4 for takeoff, and we're expecting a flight time of 3 hours and 20 minutes. The weather in Chicago is partly cloudy with temperatures around 65 degrees. We do expect some turbulence as we cross the Rockies, so we'll keep the seatbelt sign on during that portion of the flight. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight. As he switched off the intercom, Thomas couldn't help but think about the woman in 14C. He'd been needlessly harsh. It wasn't like him to lose his cool that way, especially not with passengers. His father, also a pilot, had taught him better than that. Always remember, son, his father used to say. Every person on that plane is trusting you with their life. That deserves respect no matter what kind of day you're having. The memory only deepened his guilt. Takeoff was smooth, the powerful engines propelling them into the clear blue sky. As they climbed to cruising altitude, Thomas found himself settling into the familiar comfort of flight. Up here above the clouds, his problems always seemed smaller. The cockpit was his sanctuary, The complex dance of flying, a welcome distraction from life's complications. An hour into the flight, the predicted turbulence began. Nothing severe, just enough to jostle the plane and make the passengers aware they were at the mercy of nature's whims. Thomas switched on the seatbelt sign and made another announcement. "Folks, we've hit that patch of turbulence I mentioned earlier. Nothing to worry about, but please return to your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened until we're through it." After 20 minutes of moderate bumps, Thomas decided to walk through the cabin to reassure the passengers. It was something he often did during rough patches. He found that seeing the captain calm and collected helped ease anxious travelers. As he moved down the aisle, he nodded reassuringly to passengers, stopping occasionally to chat briefly or answer questions. The plane gave a sudden lurch and Thomas steadied himself against a seatback. The passenger there, an elderly man, looked up nervously. "Just air pockets, sir," Thomas explained with a smile. "Like driving over bumps in the road." The man seemed relieved and Thomas continued his way down the aisle. That's when he noticed her again, the woman from the boarding incident. She wasn't gripping her armrests like many of the other passengers. Instead, she was still reading her book, seemingly unbothered by the turbulence. As he passed her row, she looked up. For a moment, Thomas thought she might ignore him, but instead, she raised her hand slightly. "Excuse me, Captain," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I was wondering about the aircraft's turbulence dampening system. This feels like moderate clear air turbulence, but the plane seems to be handling it differently than I expected for this model." The question caught Thomas off guard. Most passengers asked if they were going to crash or when the bumpy ride would end. This woman was asking about specific aircraft systems. He couldn't help himself. The stress of the day, the lingering embarrassment from their earlier encounter, and now this seemingly know-it-all question pushed him over the edge again. "Well," Thomas began, his tone noticeably condescending, "this big plane has special parts that help it not shake so much when the air gets bumpy." He spoke slowly, as if explaining to a child. "It's very complicated airplane stuff that takes years of training to understand. But don't worry your pretty head about it. We've got everything under control up front." Several nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A businessman across the aisle winced visibly at Thomas's patronizing tone. The woman's expression didn't change, though something flickered in her eyes, not anger or hurt, but something that made Thomas feel suddenly small. "Thank you for the explanation, Captain," she said simply, then returned to her book. As Thomas continued down the aisle, he felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Priya, the flight attendant. "What was that about?" she whispered harshly. "That was completely unprofessional, Thomas." "She was questioning the aircraft systems," Thomas defended weakly. "She asked a legitimate question," Priya countered. "And you treated her like she was 5 years old." Thomas knew she was right. Twice now, he'd let his personal troubles spill over onto an innocent passenger. His father would have been ashamed. The rest of the flight proceeded without incident. The turbulence subsided, drinks were served, and the drone of the engines lulled many passengers to sleep. Thomas remained in the cockpit, avoiding further interaction with the passengers. As they began their descent into Chicago, Thomas couldn't shake the knot of regret in his stomach. He prided himself on being a professional, on treating people with respect. Today he'd failed at that twice, with the same passenger no less. "Starting our approach to O'Hare," Lee announced, breaking into Thomas's thoughts. Thomas nodded, focusing on the task at hand. They'd make up some time in the air, arriving only 15 minutes behind schedule. At least something had gone right today. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, Thomas made his final announcement, thanking passengers for flying with Transglobal Airlines. The words felt hollow in his mouth. After parking at the gate, Thomas stood near the exit, saying goodbye to passengers as they deplaned. He hoped the woman from 14C would take the opportunity to avoid him, exiting without making eye contact, but as fate would have it, a group of slow-moving elderly tourists created a bottleneck, and she ended up standing right in front of him as they waited. The awkward silence stretched between them. Thomas opened his mouth to apologize, but before he could speak, his co-pilot approached with a strange expression on his face. "Thomas," Lee said, his voice low with an odd mix of urgency and amusement. "We need to talk. Right now, it's about the passenger in 14C. Thomas followed Lee away from the deplaning passengers, curiosity and concern battling in his mind. The look on his co-pilot's face suggested something serious. Had he received a complaint already? Was the woman in 14C someone important with the airline? What's going on? Thomas asked once they were in a quiet corner of the jet bridge. Lee leaned in, lowering his voice. You know who that was, right? The woman you were rude to, twice. Thomas felt his stomach drop. No, should I? That's Dr. Elena Reyes. The name hung in the air between them. Thomas blinked, waiting for more information. Lee looked shocked that Thomas didn't recognize it. Dr. Elena Reyes, Lee repeated, emphasizing each syllable. The Elena Reyes. The aerospace engineer who designed the turbulence dampening system she asked you about. She literally wrote the book on modern commercial aircraft design. The system she was asking about? It's called the Reyes Stabilization Framework. Named after her? Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. You're joking. I wish I was. Priya recognized her and just told me. Apparently she travels incognito sometimes to experience flights as a regular passenger. Something about seeing how her designs work in real-world conditions. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, remembering his condescending explanation about the special parts that help with turbulence. He had talked down to the very person who had invented those systems. That's not all, Lee continued, clearly enjoying Thomas's discomfort despite himself. Guess who's leading the interview panel for the Chief of Operations position next week? Thomas closed his eyes. Please don't say it. Dr. Elena Reyes is heading the selection committee. The position you applied for, Thomas. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. Thomas had been hoping for that promotion for years. After 2 decades of flying, he was ready for a leadership role that would keep him closer to home, especially now, with his marriage falling apart. The Chief of Operations position was perfect. Better pay, regular hours, and the chance to shape the airline's future. And he had just insulted, belittled, and patronized the head of the selection committee. I need to apologize, Thomas said, already turning back toward the gate. Lee grabbed his arm. She's gone. Priya said she had a car waiting. Thomas slumped against the wall. I really messed up, didn't I? Royally, Lee agreed, but his tone softened. Look, it wasn't your best day. We all have them. Maybe she'll understand that. Thomas nodded, but he knew better. In this industry, professionalism wasn't optional, especially not for someone hoping to become Chief of Operations. I need to fix this, he said, more to himself than to Lee. Back at the hotel, Thomas couldn't sleep, again. But this time, it wasn't the divorce papers keeping him awake. It was the memory of his behavior and the knowledge of who he had directed it toward. He opened his laptop and searched for Dr. Elena Reyes, aerospace engineer. The results were overwhelming. Articles in scientific journals, interviews in aviation magazines, photos of her accepting awards, a TED Talk with millions of views. In most of the photos, Dr. Reyes looked different than she had on the plane, more polished, wearing business attire instead of casual clothes, her hair styled instead of pulled back in a simple ponytail. But it was undoubtedly the same woman he had talked down. Thomas clicked on her TED Talk. The title was, Designing for the Human Experience, How Engineering Meets Emotion. He watched as Dr. Reyes explained how her traumatic experience as a child during a rough flight had inspired her career. I was 8 years old, she said on screen, terrified as our plane bounced through the worst turbulence I'd ever experienced. I asked my mother if we were going to crash. She said no, that planes were designed to handle much worse. That's when I decided I wanted to design planes that made people feel safe. Not just be safe, feel safe. Thomas felt even worse. The woman had dedicated her life to making flying less frightening for passengers, and he had mocked her for asking about her own invention. He scrolled through more search results and found that Dr. Reyes was scheduled to give a lecture at the University of Chicago's engineering department tomorrow evening. It was open to the public. Thomas knew what he had to do. The lecture hall was packed with engineering students, aviation professionals, and faculty members. Thomas felt out of place in his civilian clothes without the authority his captain's uniform usually provided. He found a seat in the back row, hoping to speak with Dr. Reyes after her presentation. The Dean of Engineering introduced her with a long list of accomplishments that made Thomas sink lower in his seat. Multiple patents, consulting work for NASA, a revolution in aircraft design that had made commercial flying safer and more comfortable for millions of passengers worldwide. When Dr. Reyes took the stage, she looked more like the professional in the photos than the casual traveler he'd encountered on his flight. She wore a tailored blazer over a simple blouse, her hair now falling in loose waves around her shoulders. She spoke with confidence and passion about the future of aerospace engineering, occasionally using technical terms that went over Thomas's head, but always circling back to the human element. The most sophisticated engineering in the world means nothing if it doesn't serve the human experience, she said. We don't design aircraft for other engineers. We design them for grandmothers visiting their grandchildren, for business people heading to important meetings, for families going on their first vacation, for people afraid of flying who white-knuckle it through every bump of turbulence. Thomas thought about all the passengers he'd transported over his career. How many had he really seen as individuals, not just seats to fill? Dr. Reyes spoke about passengers with more humanity than he had shown lately, despite his direct interaction with them. After the lecture, a crowd gathered around Dr. Reyes. Thomas waited patiently at the edge of the group, rehearsing what he would say when his turn came. After 20 minutes, the crowd thinned, and Thomas approached. Dr. Reyes looked up as he stepped forward. Recognition flickered in her eyes, but her expression remained neutral. "Captain Reed," she said, neither warm nor cold. "This is unexpected." "Dr. Reyes," Thomas began, his carefully prepared speech deserting him. "I owe you an apology. My behavior on yesterday's flight was inexcusable. I was unprofessional, condescending, and rude." She studied him for a moment. "Yes, you were." Her directness caught him off guard. He had expected her to brush it off or offer a quick, "That's okay." Instead, she acknowledged the truth of his words without softening the blow. "I know an apology doesn't undo what happened," Thomas continued, "but I wanted you to know that's not who I am, or at least not who I want to be. I let personal problems affect how I treated you and other passengers. That's not acceptable for any flight crew member, let alone someone who wants to be chief of operations." Dr. Reyes crossed her arms. "Why are you really here, Captain Reed? Because I'm on the selection committee for the position you want? Or would you have sought me out if I were just an ordinary passenger you'd treated poorly?" The question hit him like a bucket of cold water. Would he have tracked down any other passenger to apologize? He wanted to say yes, but honesty compelled him to consider the question seriously. "I'd like to think I would have," he said finally, "but knowing who you are definitely gave me extra motivation." "I can't deny that." To his surprise, Dr. Reyes smiled slightly. "At least you're honest." "Your lecture was amazing," Thomas said, changing the subject. "Especially what you said about designing for the human experience. It made me realize I've been focusing too much on the technical aspects of my job and not enough on the human side lately." "That's interesting," she replied, seeming genuinely curious. "Most pilots I meet have the opposite problem. They're great with passengers but sometimes miss technical details." "I used to be better at both," Thomas admitted. 23 years flying, and lately I feel like I'm losing my way." Dr. Reyes glanced at her watch. "I have a dinner to get to, but I have some time. There's a coffee shop across the street. Would you like to continue this conversation there? I'm curious about your perspective as a veteran pilot." Thomas was stunned by the offer. "Yes, I'd appreciate that very much." As they walked to the coffee shop, Thomas felt a weight lifting. He had come here expecting a brief, awkward apology at best and possibly being ignored at worst. Instead, Dr. Reyes was giving him a chance to redeem himself. They found a quiet table in the corner of the coffee shop. After ordering black coffee for him, herbal tea for her, Thomas found himself telling Dr. Reyes about his career, his recent struggles, and his hopes for the chief of operations position. "The divorce has been hard," he said, surprising himself with his openness. 20 years of marriage ending with paperwork on my kitchen table. I'm not using that as an excuse for how I behaved. Just explaining what was going on." Dr. Reyes nodded. "Life happens to all of us, Captain Reed. The question is how we handle it when it does." "Call me Thomas, please." "Thomas," she acknowledged. "Do you know why I travel as a regular passenger sometimes?" He shook his head. "Because designs that look perfect on paper don't always translate to real-world experience. I need to feel what passengers feel. See what they see." She sipped her tea. "Yesterday's flight was actually quite valuable for my research." Thomas winced. "I'm sorry it had to be at your expense." Don't be, she said, surprising him. Your behavior, while unprofessional, highlighted something important: how the emotional state of crew members affects the passenger experience. It's something I haven't focused enough on in my work. She pulled out a small notebook and jotted something down. In fact, I think this could be an interesting area for Transglobal to pioneer. Better support systems for crew members dealing with personal challenges. Thomas looked at her in disbelief. You're turning my terrible behavior into a research opportunity? Dr. Reyes smiled fully for the first time. That's what engineers do, Thomas. We find problems and solve them. She closed her notebook. Now about that chief of operations position. The interviews start next week. Thomas took a deep breath, preparing himself for the news that he was no longer being considered. I look forward to hearing your ideas, she said. Especially about improving crew support and passenger experience. You mean I'm still in the running? Thomas asked, unable to hide his shock. The selection committee doesn't eliminate candidates based on one bad day, she replied. Though I will say, how people handle their mistakes often tells me more about their character than their successes do. Thomas nodded, understanding the subtle message. His apology had saved his chance at the position, but the real test would come during the interview. As they finished their drinks, Dr. Reyes checked her watch again. I should go. My dinner companions will be waiting. Thank you for your time, Thomas said sincerely, and for the second chance. Everyone deserves a second chance, Captain, she said, standing to leave. The question is what they do with it. As Thomas watched her go, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just for the job, but for himself. For the possibility of becoming the kind of person and the kind of leader he had always wanted to be. His phone buzzed with a text from Priya. How did it go with Dr. Reyes? Thomas smiled as he typed his reply. Better than I deserved. I'll tell you tomorrow. I have some preparation to do for an important interview. The week leading up to the interview was the most productive Thomas had experienced in months. He threw himself into research, studying Transglobal's operations manual, reviewing industry best practices, and even reading several of Dr. Reyes's published papers. The divorce papers remained unsigned on his kitchen table, but they no longer commanded his every waking thought. On the morning of the interview, Thomas woke before his alarm. He showered, shaved, and put on his best suit, navy blue with a subtle pinstripe. He'd bought it years ago for his brother's wedding and rarely had occasion to wear it. As he adjusted his tie in the mirror, Thomas barely recognized the man staring back at him. There was a clarity in his eyes that had been missing for some time. You can do this, he told his reflection. You've earned this chance. Don't waste it. Thomas arrived at Transglobal headquarters 30 minutes early. The corporate office occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek downtown skyscraper, a world away from the cramped cockpits and noisy terminals where he spent most of his working life. At the reception desk, a young man with a friendly smile checked his name against the day's appointment list. Captain Reed, you're here for the Chief of Operations interview at 10 a.m., the receptionist confirmed. Please take a seat. Someone will come for you shortly. Thomas settled into one of the modern leather chairs in the waiting area. Other candidates came and went, men and women in sharp business attire carrying portfolios and tablet computers. Thomas had brought nothing but himself and his decades of experience. He hoped it would be enough. At exactly 10 a.m., a door opened and a woman with short gray hair approached him. Captain Reed, I'm Patricia Williams, VP of Human Resources. Please come with me. Thomas followed her down a hallway lined with photographs of Transglobal aircraft through the years. They stopped at a conference room with glass walls. Inside, 4 people sat around a large table. Thomas immediately recognized Dr. Reyes at the head of the table. Captain Reed, welcome, Patricia said as they entered. Let me introduce the selection committee. This is Howard Chen, our Chief Financial Officer. Raj Patel, current Chief of Operations who's retiring next month. Vivian Zhao, Head of Customer Experience. And Dr. Elena Reyes, Aerospace Consultant and Design Specialist. Each person nodded as they were introduced. Dr. Reyes met Thomas's eyes with a neutral expression that revealed nothing about their previous encounters. Please, have a seat, Patricia gestured to an empty chair facing the panel. Thomas settled in, taking a deep breath to calm his nerves. This was no different than handling turbulence at 35,000 feet, he told himself. Stay calm, be prepared, trust your training. Captain Reed, Howard began. You've been with TransGlobal for 23 years, all of it as a pilot. What makes you think you're qualified for an administrative position like Chief of Operations? It was a fair question and one Thomas had anticipated. Flying a commercial aircraft isn't just about technical skills, he explained. It's about resource management, decision-making under pressure, coordinating a team, and ensuring passenger safety and satisfaction. Those same skills are crucial for operations management, Thomas continued, describing specific instances from his career where he demonstrated leadership and problem-solving skills. The committee listened attentively, occasionally jotting notes. You mentioned passenger satisfaction, Vivian said when Thomas finished. How would you improve that aspect of our airline's performance? Thomas thought of Dr. Reyes' lecture and his own recent behavior. I believe passenger satisfaction starts with crew satisfaction. Happy, supported employees provide better service. He outlined a proposal for enhanced crew support systems, including better scheduling to reduce fatigue, mental health resources, and training to help staff handle personal stresses without impacting their work. As he spoke, he noticed Dr. Reyes watching him with increased interest. That's an interesting perspective, she said when he finished. Could you elaborate on how you'd implement such a program within budget constraints? For the next 45 minutes, Thomas answered questions about everything from fuel efficiency to crew scheduling to emergency response protocols. With each answer, he felt more confident. This was his world. He knew it inside and out, not just from manuals, but from lived experience. Finally, Raj leaned forward. Captain Reed, let's talk about leadership style. Can you tell us about a time when you made a mistake as a leader and how you handled it? Thomas felt his mouth go dry. This was the moment of truth. He glanced at Dr. Reyes, who gave nothing away with her expression. He could give a safe answer, something minor and easily resolved. Or he could be honest. Actually, Thomas began, my most significant leadership failure happened very recently. The room grew quieter as Thomas recounted the incident with Dr. Reyes on the flight, not sparing himself in the retelling. He described his rude behavior, his condescending attitude, and his failure to maintain professionalism under stress. I let personal problems affect how I treated a passenger, 2 times on the same flight, he admitted. It was unprofessional and inexcusable. When I discovered who the passenger was, I sought her out to apologize not just because of who she is, but because that kind of behavior isn't who I want to be as a leader. Thomas looked directly at Dr. Reyes now. The experience taught me that leadership isn't just about what you do when things are going well. It's about how you handle yourself when things fall apart, including how you address your own failures. The room was silent for a moment after Thomas finished. Howard and Vivian exchanged glances. Raj nodded slightly as if confirming something to himself. Dr. Reyes's expression remained unreadable. Thank you for your candor, Captain Reed, Patricia said finally. That concludes our formal questions. Does anyone on the panel have anything else to add? Dr. Reyes spoke up. I have one more question, if I may. She looked directly at Thomas. The Chief of Operations needs to think beyond immediate problems to long-term innovations. What do you see as the future of commercial aviation? And how would you position TransGlobal to lead in that future? It was a big question, the kind with no right answer. Thomas took a moment to gather his thoughts. I believe the future of aviation lies in balancing 3 critical factors: environmental responsibility, passenger experience, and operational efficiency, he began. We need aircraft that leave smaller carbon footprints without sacrificing performance. We need cabin designs that make flying less stressful and more comfortable for every type of passenger. And we need operation systems that can adapt to disruptions, whether that's weather, mechanical issues, or global events, with minimal impact on travelers. Thomas warmed to the topic, describing specific innovations he'd like to see TransGlobal implement. Some drawn from Dr. Reyes's own research, others from his experience as a pilot. But the most important innovation, he concluded, might be in how we think about our people, both passengers and employees. Technology changes constantly. Human needs remain surprisingly consistent. We want to feel safe. We want to be treated with respect. We want to know that someone cares about our experience. If TransGlobal can build its technological innovations around those human constants, we won't just lead the industry, we'll transform it. When Thomas finished, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small smile on Dr. Reyes's face. Thank you, Captain Reed, Patricia said. "We'll be in touch within a week regarding our decision." Outside the building, Thomas loosened his tie and took a deep breath of fresh air. Whatever happened with the job, he felt proud of how he'd handled himself. He'd been honest. He'd been prepared. Most importantly, he'd been true to the person he wanted to be, not the person he'd been on his worst day. His phone buzzed with a text from Lee. "How did it go?" Thomas smiled as he typed his reply. "I told the truth. We'll see what happens." 3 days later, Thomas was in the cockpit preparing for a flight to Denver when his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. "Captain Reed speaking," he answered. "Thomas, it's Elena Reyes." His heart skipped a beat. "Dr. Reyes, I wasn't expecting to hear from you directly. I wanted to deliver this news personally," she said. "The selection committee has made its decision regarding the chief of operations position." Thomas held his breath, bracing himself for disappointment. "We've decided to offer you the position," Dr. Reyes continued, "but with a modification to the role." "A modification?" Thomas repeated, trying to process what he was hearing. "Yes. In addition to the standard chief of operations responsibilities, we'd like you to develop and oversee a new program focused on crew, support, and passenger experience. The very initiative you proposed in your interview." Thomas was speechless. "Your honesty about your mistake impressed the committee," Dr. Reyes explained. "But it was your insight about the connection between crew well-being and passenger satisfaction that truly set you apart. We believe you're uniquely qualified to lead this initiative." "I don't know what to say," Thomas managed finally. "Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for giving me a second chance that day on the plane." "Second chances are valuable, Thomas," Dr. Reyes said. "But it's what we do with them that matters. I look forward to seeing what you do with yours." As Thomas ended the call, Lee entered the cockpit ready for their pre-flight checks. "Everything okay?" Lee asked, noticing Thomas's expression. Thomas smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Better than okay. I just got offered the chief of operations job, with a special focus on crew support programs." Lee clapped him on the shoulder. "Congratulations. Though I'll miss having you as my captain. When do you start?" "Next month," Thomas said. "But right now we have a plane to fly." As they began their pre-flight checklist, Thomas thought about the journey ahead. It wouldn't be easy. Implementing new programs never was. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path, not just in his career, but in his life. And it had all started with a mistake, an apology, and a second chance. 1 month later, Thomas stood in his new office on the executive floor of Trans Global headquarters. The space was larger than he'd expected. A corner office with windows offering a panoramic view of the city and the airport in the distance. He could see tiny planes taking off and landing, and for a moment, he felt a pang of longing for the cockpit. He unpacked the few personal items he'd brought. A model of the first aircraft he'd ever flown, a photo of his parents at his pilot graduation ceremony, and a small plant Priya had given him as a going-away gift. "So you don't forget what the sun looks like while you're stuck in meetings all day," she'd joked. Thomas was arranging these items when a knock came at his door. He turned to find Patricia Williams, the HR director, standing there with a thick binder. "Settling in, Chief Reed?" she asked with a smile. The title still felt strange to Thomas. After 2 decades as captain, being called chief would take some getting used to. "Getting there," he replied. "Though I have to admit, the view is making me a bit homesick for the skies." Patricia nodded understandingly. "Many of our executives who came from flying feel the same way. That's why we encourage you to keep your pilot certification current. You can still fly occasionally, though purely optional, of course." Thomas brightened at this news. "I'd like that very much." "Meanwhile," Patricia said, handing him the binder, "here's the current draft of the crew support initiative you proposed. Dr. Reyes has added some suggestions based on her research. She's very invested in this project." Thomas accepted the binder, surprised. "Dr. Reyes is still involved? I thought her consulting contract was temporary." "It was," Patricia confirmed. "But after your interview, she approached the board about extending her involvement specifically to work on this initiative. She seems to believe in it quite strongly." After Patricia left, Thomas opened the binder and found a note paperclip to the first page. In elegant handwriting, it read, "A chance to turn personal experience into industry-wide improvement. Looking forward to working together. Elena Reyes." Thomas smiled at the note. His mistake had not only earned him a second chance, but had sparked something larger, a program that could potentially help thousands of crew members and, by extension, millions of passengers. The first weeks in his new role passed in a blur of meetings, policy reviews, and strategy sessions. Thomas found himself drawing on skills he didn't know he had: diplomatic skills for navigating corporate politics, creative thinking for solving systemic problems, and patience for the slower pace of administrative change compared to the immediate decisions required in a cockpit. By the end of his first month, Thomas had assembled a task force for the Crew Support Initiative. It included flight attendants, pilots, ground crew, scheduling staff, and mental health professionals. Dr. Reyes joined their meetings remotely, offering insights from her research on how operational stresses affected performance and passenger experience. During one such meeting, Thomas presented data showing a correlation between crew fatigue and negative passenger feedback. "The numbers confirm what we all know intuitively," he explained to the group. "When we're exhausted or stressed, it shows in how we interact with passengers. But the airline industry has always operated this way," objected one older pilot. "Tight schedules, minimal turnaround times, maximum utilization of crew and aircraft. How can we change decades of standard practice?" "By proving there's a better way," Thomas replied. "Not just more humane, but more profitable in the long run. Happier crew members mean happier passengers. Happier passengers mean more repeat business." From the screen at the end of the table, Dr. Reyes nodded. "Thomas is right. My research shows that passenger perception of their experience is heavily influenced by crew interactions. A single negative interaction can override an otherwise perfect flight, like being ridiculed by a captain for asking a question," Thomas said with a self-deprecating smile. Dr. Reyes returned the smile. "Exactly like that." The room fell quiet, confused by this exchange. Thomas hadn't shared the full story of how he and Dr. Reyes had met with most of his colleagues. "I think this is a good time for a case study," Dr. Reyes suggested. "Chief Reed, would you mind sharing your experience from last month's flight?" Thomas took a deep breath and recounted the story of their first meeting. His rude behavior during boarding, his condescending response to her question during turbulence, and his subsequent discovery of who she was. He didn't downplay his actions or make excuses. "I was going through a divorce," he explained. "Sleeping poorly, worried about money, uncertain about my future. I let those personal stresses affect how I treated a passenger, Dr. Reyes, as it turned out. It was unprofessional and unacceptable." The task force members glanced at each other, surprised by this candid admission from their new boss. "But here's the thing," Thomas continued. "I'm not the only crew member who has ever had personal problems. I'm not the only one who has struggled to leave those problems at home. The difference is I got caught being unprofessional with someone who could have ended my career, but chose to see it as an opportunity for change instead." Dr. Reyes spoke up from the screen. "What Chief Reed isn't saying is that after discovering who I was, he tracked me down at a lecture to apologize in person. He took responsibility for his actions without excuses. That's when I realized he might be exactly the right person to lead this initiative." By the end of the meeting, the task force had outlined a comprehensive approach to crew support: adjustments to scheduling to reduce fatigue, confidential counseling services for personal issues, training on stress management, and clear protocols for crew members to request temporary reassignment during major life events without career penalties. After everyone left, Thomas stayed behind, speaking privately with Dr. Reyes through the video link. "Thank you for sharing our story with the team," he said. "I was planning to keep it between us." "Sometimes vulnerability is the strongest form of leadership," she replied. "By sharing your experience, you've given everyone permission to acknowledge their own struggles." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "How's the new turbulence prediction system coming along? The pilots I still have lunch with can't stop talking about it." Dr. Reyes brightened. "It's exceeding expectations in testing. Should be implemented fleet-wide by next quarter." "I never properly thanked you," Thomas said after a pause. "Not just for the job, but for seeing something in me worth salvaging that day." "I'm an engineer, Thomas," she replied with a small smile. "We're trained to see potential where others might see only failure." 6 months into his new role, Thomas stood at a podium in TransGlobal's largest conference room. Behind him, a screen displayed the official launch of the Crew Care program, the airline's new comprehensive support system for all staff members. The room was packed with employees, executives, and industry media. Today marks the beginning of a new approach to airline operations, Thomas announced. One that recognizes our most valuable resource isn't our aircraft or our routes or our technology. It's our people. From the front row, Dr. Reyes watched with evident satisfaction. She had flown in specifically for the launch event, her first in-person visit since their initial meetings. After the presentation, as employees mingled and explored information booths about the new program, Thomas found himself standing beside Dr. Reyes at the refreshment table. "Congratulations," she said, raising her glass of sparkling water in a small toast. "From concept to implementation in 6 months is impressive in an industry this traditional." "I had an excellent consultant," Thomas replied with a smile. "And a very personal motivation. How are you doing?" she asked, her tone softening. "With everything else, I mean." Thomas appreciated the question. Few people asked about his personal life these days. "Better," he said honestly. "The divorce was finalized last month. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. We're both moving forward now." "And the job? Do you miss flying?" "Every day," Thomas admitted. "But I still take the controls once a month to keep my certification current. And this work, making sure other pilots don't have to struggle the way I did during difficult times, it means something." "It matters," Dr. Reyes nodded. "It does matter. More than you might realize." She hesitated, then added, "That question I asked you during the turbulence that day, about the stabilization system? I wasn't just making conversation. I was gathering data for my research." "Research on aircraft systems?" Thomas asked, confused. "Research on how crew members handle passenger questions about technical systems under stress," she clarified. "Your response was actually quite informative, though not in the way you intended." Thomas groaned. "I'm never living that down, am I?" "Not as long as we're working together," Dr. Reyes said with a laugh. "But in all seriousness, that moment of failure led to all of this." She gestured around the room where dozens of employees were eagerly learning about resources now available to them. Sometimes our worst moments contain the seeds of our greatest contributions. As the event wound down, Patricia approached them. "Chief Reed, Dr. Reyes, the board is extremely pleased with the program launch. They're already talking about expanding it to other airlines through industry partnerships." "Industry partnerships?" Thomas repeated. Dr. Reyes nodded. "I've had several colleagues from other aerospace firms and airlines express interest in what we're doing here. This could become a new standard for the industry." Thomas felt a wave of pride unlike anything he'd experienced in his career. Flying a plane required skill and judgment, certainly, but creating a program that could improve working conditions for thousands of airline employees across multiple companies, that was a different level of impact entirely. As he said goodbye to Dr. Reyes later that evening, Thomas reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. A moment of rudeness, a humbling discovery, an honest apology, and now a chance to make a difference far beyond what he'd ever imagined possible. "Will you be back for the quarterly review?" he asked as they stood outside the building. "I will," she confirmed. "And Thomas? That passenger you were rude to on the plane that day? She's very glad things turned out this way." Thomas smiled. "So is that captain who was having the worst day of his life. Turns out it was actually the beginning of something much better." As Dr. Reyes's car pulled away, Thomas looked up at the Transglobal building, his new professional home. Through the windows he could see the lights of planes taking off and landing at the distant airport, carrying people to reunions and vacations, business meetings and new adventures. He no longer commanded just one of those aircraft. In a way, he now helped steer them all, along with the lives of the people who operated them. It was a responsibility he hadn't sought but now embraced fully, all because he'd been rude to the wrong passenger on exactly the right day. 1 year after the launch of the Crew Care program, Thomas stood at the window of his office watching planes take off and land in the distance. The view never got old, even after 18 months away from the cockpit. He still flew once a month to maintain his certification, but his life now revolved around conference rooms and policy documents rather than flight plans and pre-flight checks. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant Danny poked his head in. "Your car's here, Chief Reed. Don't want to be late for the aviation conference." Thomas nodded, grabbing his presentation folder. The International Aviation Leadership Conference was being held downtown. and Thomas was scheduled to speak about the crew care program, which had garnered industry-wide attention over the past year. 6 other airlines had already adopted versions of it, with promising early results. "Is Dr. Reyes already there?" Thomas asked as they walked toward the elevator. "She arrived this morning," Danny confirmed. "Her keynote speech is right before your presentation." The conference center buzzed with activity as Thomas arrived. Booths showcasing the latest in aviation technology lined the main hall, while smaller meeting rooms hosted discussions on everything from fuel efficiency to passenger entertainment systems. Thomas made his way to the main auditorium, slipping into a seat at the back just as Dr. Reyes was being introduced. The moderator listed her impressive accomplishments, and Thomas couldn't help but smile, remembering how unassuming she had looked that day on his flight. Just another passenger in casual clothes with a heavy carry-on bag. Dr. Reyes took the stage to enthusiastic applause. Her presentation focused on human-centered aviation design, how aircraft and operational systems could be engineered with human needs and limitations in mind. Toward the end, she highlighted the crew care program as a prime example. This innovative program recognizes that the human element is the most critical and often the most vulnerable component in aviation, she explained. By supporting the well-being of crew members, Transglobal Airlines has seen a 24% reduction in reported incidents, a 17% decrease in sick days, and a 12% improvement in passenger satisfaction scores. She paused, looking out over the audience. These aren't just statistics. They represent real people, pilots who can now request temporary schedule adjustments during family crises without fear of career penalties. Flight attendants who have access to confidential counseling services after difficult flights. Ground crew who can speak up about safety concerns without reprisal. Thomas felt a surge of pride. The program he'd helped create was making a tangible difference in people's lives. None of this would have been possible, Dr. Reyes continued, without the vision and leadership of Transglobal's Chief of Operations, Thomas Reed, who will be speaking next about the implementation and outcomes of this groundbreaking initiative. As Dr. Reyes concluded her presentation, Thomas made his way to the side of the stage. They passed each other at the steps, exchanging quick smiles. "Knock 'em dead, Chief," she whispered. Thomas's presentation went even better than he'd expected. He shared not just the data but the human stories behind the program, including, with Dr. Reyes's permission, the story of their first meeting. The audience laughed at his self-deprecating retelling of how he'd talked down to one of the industry's most respected engineers. "Sometimes the best innovations come from our worst moments," Thomas concluded. What began as a personal failure became the catalyst for a program that's improving working conditions throughout the industry. "The lesson I learned is that we're all human, even airline captains who are supposed to know better." The applause was gratifying, but even more meaningful were the conversations afterward. Airline executives asking detailed questions about implementation, union representatives expressing enthusiasm for bringing similar programs to their carriers, pilots thanking him for addressing issues they'd struggled with silently for years. Late in the afternoon, Thomas found a quiet corner to catch his breath. The day had been a whirlwind of presentations, panels, and networking. He checked his phone and found a text from Dr. Reyes. "Dinner at La Maison at 7. We should celebrate." Thomas smiled and texted back his acceptance. Their professional relationship had evolved into a comfortable friendship over the past year and a half. They spoke at least weekly about the program and met in person whenever her consulting work brought her to town. La Maison was an elegant French restaurant not far from the conference center. Thomas arrived a few minutes early and was surprised to find Dr. Reyes, Elena, as he now called her, already seated at a corner table. "I thought I was early," he said as he joined her. "I've learned to build in extra time when traveling," she replied with a smile. Occupational hazard of studying transportation systems. They ordered drinks, sparkling water for her, a glass of red wine for him, and fell into easy conversation about the day's events. "Your presentation was excellent," Elena said, "especially the part about our first meeting." "You've gotten quite good at telling that story," Thomas laughed. "Well, I've had plenty of practice. It's become my go-to example of how not to treat passengers, and how second chances can lead to unexpected opportunities." Their drinks arrived, and Elena raised her glass. "To second chances," she toasted. And to rude airline captains and passengers who ask too many questions, Thomas added with a grin. As they clinked glasses, Thomas reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that fateful flight. The divorce that had once seemed like the end of his world was now simply part of his past. His new role had revealed capabilities he hadn't known he possessed, and he'd gained a valued friend and colleague in the person he'd once dismissed so thoughtlessly. "I have some news," Elena said after they ordered their meals. "The Aerospace Institute has offered me a permanent position heading their Human Factors Research Division." "That's wonderful," Thomas said sincerely. "Congratulations. It would mean relocating here," she continued. "No more consulting remotely or flying in for meetings." Thomas felt an unexpected surge of pleasure at this news. "So we'd be working together more regularly?" "That's the plan," she confirmed. "The Institute wants to partner with TransGlobal on an expanded version of the crew care program, one that would integrate directly with aircraft design and operation systems." "That sounds incredible," Thomas said. "When would you start?" "Next month," Elena replied. "I've already accepted the position." Their conversation continued through dinner, the technical discussion of program expansions and research opportunities gradually giving way to more personal topics. Thomas told her about his recent attempt to learn guitar. "My neighbors probably regret living next door to me." And Elena shared stories about her childhood in New Mexico, where her fascination with flight began. As they waited for dessert, Elena looked at Thomas with sudden seriousness. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you for a while now." "What's that?" Thomas asked, curious about her change in tone. "That day on the plane," she began, "when you were so condescending about the turbulence dampening system, did you really not know who I was, or were you just having a bit of fun at my expense?" Thomas nearly choked on his water. "You think I knew who you were and deliberately insulted your own invention? To your face." Elena laughed at his reaction. "Well, when you put it that way, it does sound unlikely, but I've always wondered if there was more to the story." "Elena," Thomas said earnestly, "if I had known who you were, I would have been asking for your autograph, not talking down to you about special parts that make the plane not shake so much." He cringed at the memory. "That moment still haunts me." "Well, it worked out in the end," she said with a smile. "Though I admit the look on your face when your co-pilot told you who I was. I wish I could have seen it." "Pure horror," Thomas confirmed, followed by the sudden realization that my career was probably over. "And instead it was just beginning," Elena noted. "Funny how life works sometimes." As they finished their dessert, Thomas found himself thinking about the strange path that had brought them here. If he hadn't been going through a divorce, if he hadn't let his stress affect his behavior, if Elena hadn't been on that particular flight, none of this would have happened. The crew care program wouldn't exist. Thousands of airline employees wouldn't have access to the support they needed. He would still be in the cockpit, perhaps growing more bitter and isolated with each passing year. "Penny for your thoughts?" Elena asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "I was just thinking about how sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the best outcomes," Thomas replied. "If I hadn't been such a jerk that day, we wouldn't be sitting here now." "True," Elena agreed. "Though I prefer to think it was more than just random chance. Maybe the universe knew exactly what it was doing, putting an aerospace engineer on the flight of a stressed-out pilot who needed a wake-up call, and giving that pilot a chance to create something meaningful from his mistake," Thomas added. After dinner, they walked together through the quiet downtown streets, their conversation flowing easily from work to books to travel stories. When they reached Elena's hotel, she turned to him with a warm smile. "I'm glad we'll be working together more closely," she said. "The crew care program is just the beginning. I think we make a good team." "We do," Thomas agreed. Who would have thought that the rudest captain in TransGlobal's fleet and the passenger he insulted would end up revolutionizing airline employee support systems? Elena laughed. "It does sound unlikely when you put it that way." She hesitated, then added, "Do you ever regret it? Leaving the cockpit for an office job?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "I miss flying," he admitted. "The feeling of taking off, being above the clouds. There's nothing like it. But this work we're doing, helping people on a scale I never could have as just one captain on one plane? No, I don't regret that." "Good," Elena said, "because we have a lot more to accomplish, you and I." Thomas watched her enter the hotel, thinking about her words. They did indeed have more to accomplish. The crew care program was already evolving beyond its original scope. The partnership with the Aerospace Institute opened up possibilities he hadn't even considered yet. As he walked back to his car, Thomas glanced up at the night sky where stars peeked through the city's light pollution. Somewhere up there, planes were crossing the dark, their navigation lights blinking steadily. In each cockpit, a pilot like he once was facing their own challenges, personal and professional. Thanks to one bad day and one remarkable second chance, those pilots now had resources he never had. Support when they needed it, understanding when they struggled. A system that recognized they were human before they were employees. Not a bad legacy, Thomas thought, for a captain who had once been rude to a passenger. Not a bad second act at all.